Nosotros no necesitamos de esa lindura ni eso para hacer música. Con 4 hierros y 4 palos formamos una rumba que no cree en nadie.
Have you ever heard about the secret chants that echoed through the cobblestone streets of colonial Cuba centuries ago? They were known as coros de clave and coros de guaguancó. If you happen to know a little about this music, let me warn you, this video is not just about music. It is also a tale of traditions blending and evolving, a fusion where African beats collided with Spanish melodies, creating a tapestry of sound that shaped an entire culture. The Coros de Clave were choral groups that walked and danced through the streets of western Cuban cities like Havana and Matanzas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. To understand how these choirs even got there, we must first look into the historical context in which they were born. Slavery was practiced in Cuba from the 16th century until it was abolished by Spanish royal decree in 1886. The transatlantic slave trade primarily supported Spanish plantation owners who made fortunes with the sugarcane industry. In the late 16th century, African ethnic associations called cabildos were formed in Cuba. Cabildos had actually originated as administrative councils in medieval Spain, but in colonial Cuba, they were recreated as unique mutual aid societies that were organized by slaves and later by African descendants. During colonial times, it was common for slave masters to identify and name slaves according to their distinct ethnicities from Africa. Even though these names were often linguistic approximations of actual tribal names from Africa, they eventually became used by the slaves themselves. Cabildos became very popular in the urban areas, and Spanish legislation allowed them because they were a form of entertainment for the slave population, and consequently, an effective way to alleviate the tensions between the masters and the slaves. Cabildo members were allowed to gather on holidays so they could dance according to the customs of their African nations. In these gatherings, they could consult their deities and ancestors, so for slaves, the cabildos were places of spiritual relief, and they made possible the conservation of their religions and cultures of the African nations in Cuba. For the government of the island, cabildos were seen as a necessary evil, but by the 18th century, these spaces of cultural autonomy began to worry slave owners. In the articles of the 1792 Bando de Policía y Buen Gobierno, they addressed the necessity of controlling the cabildos and their members. The slave celebrations were often perceived as too wild and heretic, disturbing the social order preferred by the dominant class. By the 19th century, cabildos were relocated outside the walls of the city of Havana so that no one in the city would have to see or hear the African celebrations. In 1884, the Cuban government outlawed the Afro-Cuban syncretic version of the Catholic celebration of Epiphany, known in Cuba as Dia de Reyes. This was a celebration cabildos had practiced for more than a century, and it included dancing and parading through the streets with carnival processions named comparsas. Once slavery was finally abolished in 1886, authorities found new means of controlling the now free Afro-Cuban population. New laws required cabildos to obtain prior official recognition before engaging in any kind of gathering or celebration, and members were forced to organize into mutual aid societies. Since the middle of the 19th century, at the cabildos in the Cuban colonial town of Trinidad, choral groups performed the so-called tonadas trinitarias, or songs of Trinidad. As part of this tradition, large choirs, each over 100 members from different neighborhoods, would gather together to compete while parading through the streets. The origin and development of the coros de clave is as linked to the local cabildos as it is to the traditions imported by immigrants from northern Spain, in particular the nearly identically named coros de clave, which were named after the Catalonian composer Josep Anselm Clavé. The Cuban coros de clave were not named after the percussion instrument, even though claves were actually used in the performance. Starting in 1845, clave established orfeones, which were choirs made up of working-class people in Barcelona. These choirs became very popular in northern Spain, and upon introduction in Cuba by Spanish immigrants, the coros de clave lost their accent, becoming coros de clave. In Cuba, the choirs often brought together up to 150 members who sang in 6/8 time with European harmonies and instruments. Within these large choirs, some members served special functions. The decimista was the primary composer of the group. The tonista kept the group in tune and functioned as a conductor, and the censor was responsible for the quality of the lyrics and the beauty of the melodies. The décima, a Spanish 10-line poetic form, was the most common lyrical structure of coros de clave. This poetic form, which had been popularized by Spanish poet and lyricist Vicente Espinel, made its way into the singing of the Cuban coros de clave, and it would eventually become a distinctive feature of rural Cuban music. The claves play the main rhythmic pattern in the genre, which is known as the vertical hemiola. In music, a vertical hemiola happens by superimposing a simple rhythmic pulse over a compound pulse. In this case, simple means that each pulse can be divided into two smaller subdivisions, like when we turn each one of these quarter notes into 2/8 notes. Compound, on the other hand, means that each pulse can be divided into three smaller subdivisions, like when we turn each one of these dotted quarter notes into 3/8 notes. The rhythmic pattern resulting from combining simple and compound pulses became easily recognizable, not only in the music of coros de clave, but also in many other musical genres of rural music that later inherited. The accompaniment of the choirs frequently included one or more guitars. The percussion was executed over the soundbox of a stringless American banjo, due to the fact that playing African drums was actually strictly forbidden in Cuba at the time. In addition, the instrumentation often included a botija, a traditional Spanish earthenware jug that was blown to serve as a bass instrument. Coros de clave and coros de guaguancó are often discussed as part of the same tradition. Scholars can't seem to agree on what came first, or whether these two types of choir developed completely independently. But what we do know is that the coros de clave repertoire was more often used in the teatro bufo or comic theater tradition, and it would eventually become associated with three well-established rural music styles of Cuba: the clave, the criolla, and the guajira. On the other hand, the coros de guaguancó were influential on the development of the rumba, a major musical genre of Afro-Cuban music. Unlike the coros de clave, the coros de guaguancó retained more elements from African musical traditions and became known for having a higher proportion of male singers. So strong were the links between these colonial societies and the Afro-Cuban Cabildo tradition that some coros de guaguancó were dedicated to preserving the religion and traditions of slaves and descendants from the ancient kingdom of Dahomey, present-day Benin. The coros de guaguancó also incorporated membrane percussion instruments and were generally sung in 2/4 as compared with the typical 6/8 meter characteristic of the coros de clave. Wooden boxes of various sizes, called cajones, were used in the place of prohibited African drums. These cajones became a central instrument of early rumba. Also typical in the coros de guaguancó was the spirit of friendly rivalry between the different choirs, which often used pullas or lyrical battles of wit between groups. Many coros de guaguancó were active in Havana as early as 1862. One of them, Los Roncos, had as its main composer a young man who would become legendary son musician Ignacio Piñeiro. Although Coros de Clave and Guaguancó do not seem to have been recorded in their original manifestations, their influence lives on in secular traditions still practiced in Cuba. The mobile performance format of Coros de Clave is echoed in the Cuban carnival procession known as comparsas, which are also ambulatory ensembles that parade through the streets and engage neighborhoods in lyrical competition and friendly rivalry. The most important legacy of this tradition is in the arena of the rumba. Prominent rumba groups, such as the Havana-based Clave y Guaguancó and the Matanzas-based Muñequitos de Matanzas, still perform songs in the style of the original Coros de Clave y Guaguancó. I hope that you enjoyed exploring the vibrant tapestry of this music, woven from African roots and Spanish influences. Many things are wrong with the history of Cuba, the grim reality of slavery during colonial times being just one of them. But the music Cubans synthesized from the traditions of these African nations and Spain continues to showcase the beauty of its diversity and the resilience of its traditions. Studying these Coros de Clave and Coros de Guaguancó is an important way to honor and perpetuate the legacy of this unique musical heritage, recognizing its profound impact on Cuba's cultural landscape and beyond.